Before there was Disneyland, and before there were fireworks over castles, long lines for Dole Whip, and an empire of beloved characters, there was just a man named Walt and a city called Los Angeles. In this episode, we're stepping off Main Street and onto the real streets, exploring the places where Walt Disney lived, worked, dreamed, and built the foundation for everything that came after. Welcome to Pop Culture Passport, your ultimate guide to quirky and cool destinations across the US. I'm your host, Beth Scalacci, aka the Roman Yeti, here to help you dive into the world of theme parks, uncover film and TV locations, and explore quirky museums, roadside attractions, and legendary venues that capture the heart and soul of this unique country. So grab your pop culture passport and let's discover destinations that resonate with your interest, not just with what's trending on social media. Are you ready? Let's roam. Welcome back. Today we are skipping the parks and heading out into the city to explore Walt Disney's Los Angeles. We're going beyond the gates of Disneyland to trace the real-life journey of Walt Disney through LA. From his earliest garage-turned studio to the quiet corners of Griffith Park that sparked a world-changing idea. On our recent trip to LA, we visited several of these stops. Others we had seen previously as part of the Adventures by Disney tour, and others, well, they're still on my to visit list. So, whether you're a lifelong Disney fan or just someone who loves a good origin story, this episode is packed with hidden gems and historical magic. Let's start walking in Walt's footsteps. So, stop one is going to be the Hyperion Studio site. And before Burbank and before Mickey Mouse was a household name, there was a little animation studio in Silver Lake. And in 1926, Walt and Roy Disney made their first big investment, and that was putting down a deposit on a small lot in what was then known as Evandale, today's Silver Lake neighborhood. The studio they built here at 2007-19 Hyperion Avenue wasn't just their first custom built space. It was a creative crucible that launched the Disney we know today. Inside this modest studio, they produced early classics like Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and then after a painful rights battle that cost them Oswald, they rebounded with something new, a character named Mickey Mouse. It's hard to overstate how much happened on this single city block. This was the studio that gave us Steamboat Willie, The Skeleton Dance, Flowers and Trees, Three Little Pigs, and ultimately Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, the first full-length animated feature in history. It was a place full of invention and energy. Animators would set things on fire, splash in bathtubs, and study the physics of motion just to get their drawings right. It was art and science and storytelling all rolled into one. By the late 1930s, the studio had grown into a full-on campus with over 1,000 employees working around the clock. But even with all the creativity inside, the space was limited. It couldn't keep up with the vision Walt had for the future. After the success of Snow White, the company moved to a larger, purpose-built campus in Burbank. Now, the Hyperion studio itself was demolished in 1960s, and today there's a grocery store and a parking lot in its place. But if you go, you will find a small marker out front, um, recognizing where it once stood. This is a location we have not visited yet, but it's definitely on our to-do list. From the site of the Hyperion Studio, let's head just a couple miles northeast into the hills of Los Feliz, specifically to a quiet residential street called Lyric Avenue. This is where Walt and his wife Lillian made one of their first major purchases after the success of Mickey Mouse, and that was a new home. In 1929, a year after Steamboat Willie premiered, Walt and Roy bought identical homes next to each other. Walt and Lillian were at 2495 Lyric Avenue, and Roy and his wife Edna were next door at 2491. It was a pretty bold sibling move, and it says a lot about how closely knit their partnership really was. They didn't just work together, they built their lives side by side, quite literally. This was a big moment for Walt. After years of bouncing between rented apartments and living with relatives, buying a home meant stability. It meant roots. And it reflected just how far he'd come in such a short amount of time, from a failed animator in Kansas City to creator of one of the most beloved characters in the world. We visited this spot during our trip, and I have to say it's kind of magical in its simplicity. No plaque, no statues, just a classic Los Feliz home nestled on a quiet street. If I hadn't looked up pictures, I wouldn't have even known I was in the right place. Um, but knowing Walt lived here during such a transformational period for both the company and his personal life, it really hits you and really adds weight. This house is a symbol of transition. It marks that moment when Walt wasn't just building a business, he was building something bigger, including a life. And even though the real magic was happening at the studio, I like to imagine that there was probably some late night storyboarding or quiet conversations about the future over coffee at the house. And not far from the Lyric Avenue house is one of my favorite visual surprises in all of Walt's LA, and it's the Snow White cottages. Now, they're tucked into the Los Feliz neighborhood as well. They're on Griffith Park Boulevard, and it's this row of storybook style bungalows, and they were built in 1931. So think steeply pitched roofs, leaded glass windows, dark wood beams, and that classic fairy tale charm that looks like it leapt off the pages of a Brothers Grimm story, or perhaps off the screen of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. And that's not a coincidence. So several Disney animators lived there in the 1930s. They were walking distance from the Hyperion studios, names like Fred Moore, Dick Lundy, and Ham Lusk, key players in bringing Snow White to life. Now, they called these cottages their home. So imagine finishing a day of animating woodland creatures and walking home to a house that looked like it belonged in the forest with them. The influence was clearly mutual. The whimsical curves, stone chimneys, and cozy proportions of these real homes almost certainly inspired the final look of the dwarf's in the film. They're just so cute. They're private residences, you can't go inside, but you can see them from the street. Some are rentals, some have had the same owners for decades, but they're just so well maintained, and it really feels like you're walking into, like, Fantasyland at Disneyland, but nope, they're right there. It's just one of those places that makes LA feel like a living, breathing archive of pop culture, which I've said before, and it's just proof that sometimes inspiration doesn't just strike in the studio, it starts at home, quite literally. So, let's move from fairy tales to trains, because Walt Disney wasn't just a dreamer, he was a builder. And nowhere is that more evident than at the Carrollwood Barn, which is now tucked inside of Griffith Park. So, in the late 1940s, Walt and Lillian finally built their dream home in Holmby Hills. But what made it so magical for Walt wasn't the house, it was the backyard. And that's where he built the Carrollwood Pacific Railroad, a fully functioning 1/8 scale train that wound through 2,600 feet of track, complete with bridges, switches, and a tunnel that famously ran under his wife's flower bed. And in the middle of it all was the Red Barn, and it was a replica of the one from Walt's childhood home in Marceline, Missouri. And it became his personal workshop, just a place where he designed train cars, controlled the switches, and worked on other ideas. And it wasn't just about trains. This was also where the seeds of Imagineering were planted. Walt tested ideas here, tinkered with scale, movement, immersion. It was his sandbox for what would become Disneyland. Walt's daughter Diane later called it the birthplace of Imagineering. It was quiet, personal, creative, and totally hands on. After Walt's death, the Carrollwood home was eventually sold, and in 1998 it was demolished. But thanks to preservation efforts, especially from Diane Disney Miller, the barn was saved, disassembled, and rebuilt at the Los Angeles Live Steamers Museum in Griffith Park. Today, it's a public space and it's usually open one Sunday a month. I believe it's usually the third Sunday. And inside, you'll find Walt's original tools, photos, miniature trains, and stories from his friends and colleagues. So, if you're a Disney fan who loves the behind the scenes, this is a must visit. Now, unfortunately, we did not know about the third um, Sunday until we had already booked our trip. So we didn't get to visit it. But if this is a must do, check the schedule and plan your trip a little better than we did. Okay. Next stop is probably one of the most famous, maybe sentimental stop on the list. And this is the Griffith Park merry-go-round. And it's the place where the seed for Disneyland was born. And in 1940s, Walt used to bring his daughters here on the weekends. And while they rode the carousel, he'd sit on a bench nearby watching families enjoy time together. He later said that on one of those visits, he looked around and thought, there should be a place where parents and children can have fun together. And that idea stuck, and it grew. And a little over a decade later, it became Disneyland. Now, the carousel was built in 1926 and has 68 hand carved horses, all of which jump, and a classic band organ that still plays. But the real magic is that bench. One of the originals was moved to Disneyland and is now displayed at the Opera House on Main Street. But there are replicas here and also at the Walt Disney Family Museum in San Francisco. And unfortunately, this area has seen better days. There's some ownership issues and legal disputes, and it's really sort of put the future of the carousel in a lot of uncertainty. And at the time of this recording, it may be open on certain weekends. I I don't know, but if you can catch it running, um, and even if you can't, we didn't see it running. As a matter of fact, it had the doors down. We didn't even get to see the horses, but it was just still something magical, being where that seed for Disneyland happened. Um, it's a very cool place. It would be great to see the carousel. I hope when you go, you get to see it. I hope the legal issues get taken care of. But again, it's just one of those origin stories of how something can inspire something even greater. So, our next stop is a cozy little restaurant that just might be one of the most underrated Disney locations in Los Angeles, and that is the Tam O'Shanter Inn. Now, this was built in 1922, and it is a Tudor style pub, which is one of the first themed restaurants in LA. Designed with sort of that storybook look, filled with Scottish inspired decor. And it feels like one of those places you'd find in Fantasyland, but again, this one was real. And Walt Disney was a regular at Tam O'Shanter's. So him and his animators would come here for lunch from nearby Hyperion Studio, and they would brainstorm characters, sketch ideas on napkins, and discuss stories over meals. Now, Walt's favorite table was table 31, and it was tucked in the corner for, a bit of privacy, and it became their unofficial war room for the golden age of Disney animation. They didn't just eat, they created. Some of the early planning for Snow White and Pinocchio happened here over plates of roast beef and probably some steins of beer. But the best part, you can still eat here today. And yes, you can also book Table 31 as part of a special dining experience. They even offer a curated meal and share bits of the restaurant's Disney lore. Now, while we didn't eat on this past trip in May, we had eaten there as part of our Disney Adventures by Disney trip in 2022. And it was just sort of cool to see actual places where Walt and the Imagineers, we got to sit at the table. There's a cool picture above. Um, and it's just that reminder that creativity doesn't always happen in the office or the studio. Sometimes it comes out over, some fries and conversation, but definitely put Tam O'Shanter's on your list. It's a fun place, good food, and definitely some Disney history there for sure. Now, after the success of Snow White, Walt needed bigger space, something more purpose built for the next chapter of Disney animation. So in 1939, construction began on a new studio campus in Burbank, funded entirely by the profits from Snow White. It opened in 1940 and has been Disney's creative headquarters ever since. And this was more than just a building. It was the first animation studio in the world designed specifically for animation. It had inking rooms with slanted windows to catch the perfect light, sound stages, editing bays, a commissary, screening rooms, and even underground tunnels to keep animation cells safe from the elements. This is where the Disney studio flourished through the 1940s and 50s. Think Fantasia, Bambi, Cinderella, and Peter Pan. It was also the place where Walt planned Disney World, literally drawing up blueprints in his office. In the decades since, the campus has grown and changed, but many of the original buildings remain. Today, the centerpiece is the Team Disney building, sometimes called the Seven Dwarfs building, because there are massive statues of the dwarfs literally holding up the roof like columns. It is so cool to see. And just outside is the Disney Legends Plaza, which honors influential Disney contributors from animators to Imagineers to performers. It's like their walk of fame right there. And the plaza includes the famous Partners statue of Walt and Mickey and one of Roy and Minnie as well. Now, the studio is not open to the public on a daily basis. You can sometimes get a special tour through D23. It's also, or at least it was, a stop for Adventures by Disney trip when we went, it was just so cool to walk through those studios and, the outside. We didn't go inside a whole lot because we were just coming out of the pandemic and some things were limited. But it was really cool to see that building with the seven dwarfs. We went to see where the archives were, and in the building that had Marvel offices. We weren't allowed near those Marvel offices, but we saw the door. But this is just the heartbeat of the company that Walt built. And it's, if you get a chance to do it, it's pretty impressive. So while we're in the area of, the studios, here's a bonus stop that you can add to your route, and that's the Walt Disney Imagineering headquarters in Glendale. Um, we all know what the Imagineering is, those creative minds behind the theme parks and attractions. And while Walt never worked in the building himself, it opened after his death. It just represents that evolution of his vision. And Imagineers were those animatronics and so many ride systems started. And think of it, like it went from the barn to the Imagineering headquarters. Like how cool. The building is at 1401 Flower Street. It is not open to the public, and again, tours are extremely rare. Adventures by Disney sometimes goes through there. We did. We did not go in any buildings. We were allowed out in the courtyard and in the store. But we did run into Josh Giarmo, so that was pretty cool. But you can still drive by and, sort of see the outside of the building. And, if you're going to be close by, why not, right? So before we wrap up, I can't skip Hollywood Boulevard entirely. And while Walt definitely wasn't your red carpet guy, his presence is definitely felt still on Hollywood Boulevard. First of all, there's Walt's star on the Hollywood Walk of Fame, and it's near El Capitan Theater. And it was one of the original stars awarded in 1960. So, if you want to grab a picture there. Then there's now it's the TCL Chinese Theater, and it was the Grauman's then when Mary Poppins premiered in 1964. And even though Walt, again, wasn't much for like the glitz and glam, this was a major moment in his career. And, just such a triumph of film for him. And finally, then I have to point out across the street from the Chinese theater is the El Capitan Theater. And while Walt never saw it in its current form, because Disney purchased and restored it in the early 1990s, it's now official home to Disney movie premieres and Disney movies. It is gorgeous inside. It has a live organist and a like curtain show, like a projection show on the curtains. It's just really gorgeous in there. They regularly screen classic and new Disney, Marvel, Star Wars films. They often have costumes from whatever the recent thing is. So it's definitely fun to check out. And you don't have to spend a ton of time seeing these, but if you're downtown, it's just a fun way to sort of cap off your Walt's LA trip. Now, walking through Walt Disney's Los Angeles is like flipping through the early pages of a very well loved book. The part before the story becomes legend. You see the struggle, the hustle, the little wins that didn't feel like wins at the time. It's a version of Walt that's more human, more scrappy, more relatable. We're so used to seeing the polished final product, the fireworks, the castle, the branding. But here in LA, you can still see the cracks in the sidewalk where Walt stood, the restaurant booth where he sketched, the carousel bench where he dreamed. These places remind you that even the biggest ideas start small and often start over lunch. And with that, we add another stamp to our pop culture passport. I hope that this episode inspires you to get out and explore all that is quirky and cool, even in your own backyard. Follow, download, and subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And please tell a friend and leave a review and rating if you like what we're doing. It really helps our show to grow. You can also follow me on Instagram or Facebook. Just search for The Roaming Yeti. Keep roaming and finding your fun.